Hi, hi, Uma. Thanks for joining us here at Writing Society. Well, we're actually very happy and excited to have you. And to
Thank you. Thank you for asking me. I'm thrilled.
glad you are. Glad. So I've just got a good few questions, and hopefully we'll get some conversation going off those as well, and just have a nice chat.
Yeah.
What this will be like, and then hopefully towards the end we may get some other questions popped in by other students and stuff. So I suppose I'll start with, well, we were just talking before recording, briefly about you having your boys' school having their lessons in the other room and publishing in COVID times and everything. I suppose I just wanted to ask you, now you have these three lovely boys and the new home and COVID going on, does that shift in space that you're working with and the time that you're working with affect how you approach your writing?
Yes, it does. And in some ways, I've always been writing on stolen time. I think that's not specific to me, and it's not specific to motherhood at all either. I think many of us, when we're starting to write, you will often have other things like a paid job or your studies or at whatever stage you're at. And it takes a long time to get to a point where actually all you do is write the book and you're not supplementing it in some ways in that kind of practical or financial way. And I think when you are starting to explore your own writing, so just by way of background, I've been a journalist for since I'd left university a long time ago now. I was a journalist at The Guardian and The Observer, so I was writing for my living, but I wasn't writing what I wanted to write, which was books. So there is this kind of push and pull between finding a way to write and making space for what you want to write, and being so giving yourself permission to justify that you can spend time on your creative endeavors in the hope that it will get you to where you want to be. And for every, sometimes there's a lot of people, I teach writing courses as well, and on my writing courses there's people that are very clear that they don't need it to be published, they just want to do it for themselves. And I think for some people there is that. For me, it wasn't that. Being published was my end goal because I needed to do something tangible with it. And I had only ever wanted to be a writer. And so choosing a path that allowed me to write professionally as a journalist was a way of training myself in a very different kind of writing. But at the same time, even though I was writing every day, it didn't necessarily give me the time or space to do what I really wanted, which was, at that point, I was writing short stories for myself, and I knew very little about craft. I didn't study it in that sense. I was reading a lot, but I wasn't studying and putting things together because I just wouldn't give myself permission to do so. The turning point for me, to answer your question, was when I did decide to make time for it, was really when I found myself at this crossroads of having had a couple of children and questioning what I wanted to do with the limited time that I did have to work. And it had reached a point in my life where I could justify saying, you know what, I don't have a book deal, but I want a book deal and I want to write this story and I'm going to write this story. So this is the time that I have, and I'm going to spend all my time on this. So I cut back on freelance journalism and I focused on this book, and then I used the same approach for the next one as well, which was pretty much, in order to write, I had to focus just on one thing. I couldn't be juggling several different outlets of writing this for this newspaper or that for this paper, and then also trying to squeeze in the book. So my priorities had to shift. So the book came first, even though I had no idea if it would get as far as it has done. So yeah. I think shifting your priorities and believing in them and giving yourself permission to justify writing when the conventional world expects you to do something more traditional perhaps, or has that attitude that, well, this isn't a job, how can you make a living out of it? But you can. You just have to be really blinkered in your vision, and I was blinkered in my vision. I wouldn't even say I've got that. I mean, I'm very grateful that so many things have happened in the last few months, which means that my next 2 books are also now in the pipeline, which is just unbelievable. So that, I think that is as a result of taking that stolen time and putting everything I had into it.
Yeah, that's very good. It's very good. Yeah, I'm personally very glad to see that you've come out of it with these 2 books that are coming up, and it's just exciting to.
It is.
It's very exciting. Going back a little, well, should we jump to that? Yeah, we'll jump to this one. So coming off that time that you set aside for the books and everything, what were your usual go-to writing habits in that time? What helped you?
So the first thing I would do was read, actually, read something else, not by me, a book, whether it was just, like, for instance, at the moment, I'm writing my own, I'm also writing a novel, which I also have a book deal for, which is amazing. I haven't even written it yet, but I always have a pile of books on the go. So before I start writing, I just start reading. This just so happens to be something on my book pile, and I just find spending, even if it's as little as 10 or 15 minutes, just concentrating on reading a book, not having any screens open, not looking at my phone, just reading in a really quiet, enjoyable way, underlining a few words. I'm not doing it from a perspective of, oh, this is research. I'm just purely doing it to enter into a kind of mindset, a quieter mindset. And it just helps me transition from outside world, the busyness of daily life, to actually, I need to get into the headspace of writing. And reading someone else's words just always helps me do that. It just makes that kind of bridge between one thing and the other thing, and one world and the other world. And so that is one of my biggest and most simplest practices, is just reading, spending a little bit of time reading before I start writing. And that's something I also do when I get stuck. So if I find myself struggling or not knowing where I'm going with something in my own writing, I will stop and I will turn to, and then my reading is a bit more specific, and I will turn to authors that I am constantly impressed by, and sort of see them as a bit of a manual, and I look at how they describe something like grief or I don't know, a turmoil in a marriage or something, and I just sort of examine it, and then I read it a bit more critically, and I look at what's worked and why do I like that, and I try and kind of study it a little bit more. But that's a different kind of reading to my first 10 to 15 minutes of sitting down to write is actually spent reading for the pleasure of it, really. So that's my biggest habit. And then after that, I I'll go back to my draft, and I'll try not to. I used to have this habit of going back to the beginning and then reading it through, which is great when you're writing short stories. Yeah. Not so great when you're trying to write a novel which is about 80,000 words, because otherwise I just spend all day reading and not going forward. But I do still find that I need to read like the last maybe 2 pages to then pick up from where I've left off the day before. Sometimes I'll make notes off screen in my notebook to kind of, I plan, but I also don't over plan. So if I'm just working out a particular scene, I'll just jot it down, not in any great detail, but just enough to say, look, what emotion am I trying to convey, so that I don't forget or lose track of my chain of thoughts. And then I just start writing.
Fantastic. That's pretty good. It's lovely. So, okay, little questions popped to me. Just wondered if I could ask it. Is there a particular way you structure your notebook at all? So, or is it just random, just things go in, there's no dates on them, or do you have a bit more of a...
Let's have a look, shall we? No dates by the looks of it. No, it's all, it's quite literally just scribbles. So it's not very organised. However, that said, I did go through, for this novel that I'm writing, it explores themes of the dark side of our closest relationships, I suppose. So I was looking for that. I kind of look for it everywhere. So when I hook onto an idea in the early stages, I look for that idea in everything and everywhere, and I look for it on almost subconsciously as well, whether it's something I'm watching on TV, or something that reminds me of something I've read before. I'll go back and pick out what is it that I've really hooked on, like what is it that really got me. And for this, there was a couple of scenes from a series called The Affair. I don't know if you know The Affair, but there's a couple of scenes that kind of flashed back to me. So I must have watched it like last year or something, and it kind of popped back in my head like, that was really smart. How did they do that? Let's go back and revisit that, and what did I like about it? So I spent a bit of time writing down dialogue, because I think that really helps, especially with dialogue. I think watching it on screen really helps with the writing of it, because sometimes dialogue when written it's too much, I find sometimes. But then, like, if you read things like Sally Rooney, where the dialogue is so simple, it's so real, and that's the way people speak. So I find things like that is quite useful to sort of not necessarily study, but to watch something back with a specific in mind, to see how a certain conversation happens. So I'll like make notes. So at the beginning of my notebook, the reason I'm telling you that is at the beginning of my notebook, I watched these various moments from that drama with the subtitles on, so I could just write down the dialogue and see how it worked, and then kind of you teach yourself from that, by seeing how that emotion is conveyed. So the first part of my notebook was like dialogue, because that was something I wanted to explore, and then the rest of it is it's just me working it out.
Just getting things down. Going back to the dialogue and watching from films and things, do you also note down like the actions that characters are taking within the dialogue, like while they're speaking?
I'm not very action driven. I don't know. What's interesting in my kind of journey is that I've gone from journalist, fact and action, I suppose, reporting, to the first book, which was creative non-fiction. So it was still very non-fiction. It was very interview based. It was very specific about another person, and I was very removed from it. To then writing my memoir, which is of course personal, so it is me, to then going to fiction. And in my fiction and in my memoir as well, so when I step away from other people and the story becomes a little bit more interior, whether it's me or whether it's a character's interior, I feel like for me, my writing, people when they say the whole show don't tell thing, I always really struggle with that, because I don't fully get it, and I feel that maybe it's a little bit outdated to say I don't know, but for me, the showing of it can be very, it doesn't have to be this overwritten thing. So for me, action can be very simple and very understated. So I often hold that in my head. So the imagery is really I often think when I'm writing, especially in fiction, I do see it playing like a scene from a film that's possibly not even made. Do you know what I mean? But I can picture it. So I sort of look at a scene in the way that a camera would span, even though I've got no background in this whatsoever. I just think of it as someone who might enjoy watching something. And it's the little details that stand out to me more, even in those kind of really intimate moments of, I don't know, two people meeting each other in the street, and the way she might put her hair behind her ear. That to me is more meaningful than saying that they were walking down this road, and they, like, putting it in the bigger context. To me, it's really narrowing down the focus. So the action is, I guess, in my fiction, I'm one of those writers in which you could argue that not a lot happens action-wise, but a lot happens in a more intimate and emotional level, I guess. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, it does very much. Yeah.
Maybe it does. I don't know. I might have just started waffling on that. So, but yeah, I think for me, it's when you say about, like, noting down those gestures, I think it's really important, because you see all that on screen in a way that is hard to convey in writing. But I think the way to convey it in writing is to strip it back and just capture the kind of fleeting moments that would otherwise pass you by, but are really, actually really significant, and they tell the story. That's your telling of it, or your showing of it, however you want to describe it.
And I think you mentioning the camera lenses are particularly interesting, in the sense of you would have, just thinking aloud, you would have your camera lens pointed at a certain angle, looking at the scene one way, and you would write it that way.
Yeah.
But then perhaps another person thinking of a similar scene would have a different camera angle, and
absolutely,
maybe not even be focusing on details, like you've said, like if we're thinking of, like, photographers, so it's like the macro lens focus of even the small detail of, like, the nails of the person putting the hair behind the ear. They might have that wide view of what's the street like.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that's actually a really good analogy to short stories and a novel, because in the short, and I think that's what I'm learning as this is going to be my first novel. My collection of short stories is going to come out in November. And in a short story, what I love about them, as both reading them and writing them, is just how intense they can be in a small, condensed form. So much happens, but you can allow yourself to focus on something that really is just one moment of intensity that has this lasting impact. It's, for instance, like, I don't know if you've ever read any Alice Munro, but her short stories, every time I'm hungry to be taught something, if I pick up an Alice Munro short story, it will teach me something about how one moment can be so significant for a lifetime. And I suppose that's your short story, that's your close-up camera lens. And then the novel, though, and this is something I am learning as I'm writing my first novel, is you have to both have that, or I want to both maintain the intimacy, but I also have to step back and have the wider camera angle in order for the story to move on, because they are very different forms, and it's not like a short story is just a chapter. A short story is its own entity, so it's too simplified to say I'm just going to put a series of short stories together and hope it becomes a novel. That's very different to a collection of short stories versus a novel. So yeah, you're absolutely right that you have these two different camera shots. The beauty, I suppose, is in trying to put them together. So yeah, I'd say that's a really good analogy for how a novel plot might work.
Wonderful. I'm going to take it back, I suppose, a little bit, back again to the Sally Rooney dialogue and films and things. Just some quick, I suppose, top three recommendation of books and films. You've kind of mentioned a few names of but what's a film that you've always...
You've absolutely put me on the spot. Top
What's the book
three
you're about?
recommendations. Well, one of my favourite authors is Jhumpa Lahiri, and who has her first book in several years coming out this summer, so which is hotly anticipated. Jhumpa Lahiri wrote the book. I might have it here actually, possibly behind me. But she wrote the book. The names, but actually, which is her novel, but my favourite one of her books is Unaccustomed Earth, which is a collection of short stories, which I absolutely love because of not just because of who she is, because her background is Indian American. My background, I mean, my parents were Pakistani. I was born and brought up here, but it's not actually just because of that. In fact, that's almost in a way irrelevant. The fact that I connect to her stories on that level, it's the way that she writes is just so simple and so stark in a way, but also with these touches of real beauty that's never overdone. There's no sentimentality, and her descriptions are, they really are subtle and so understated, and yet they say so much. And that, I don't know, it's like Alice Munro. I count them both as a masterclass in short story writing. And if there's anyone that has any interest in short stories, those are my go-tos, and I give them to people as presents, and I press them into people's hands, because her writing is that beautiful kind of rare, subtle writing that lasts in a way that is really timeless. It's something I really aspire to, is writing in a way that feels timeless, and she does that magically. And not only that, I mean, the themes of her stories they're everything that resonate with me as a reader and also as a writer, about relationships and turmoil and loss and love, everything that I suppose every writer at some level concerns themselves with, but she does it in a way that is very effortless. So yes, she would be one of them. That's my top one, I guess. Who else would I recommend? I do love Normal People. I have read it. I avoided reading it at first because I just saw it as hype, which sounds unfair, but I just wasn't, I don't know, maybe the way that it was packaged or marketed, I just assumed it wouldn't be for me. And then when I finally did read it, I just loved it, and my heart melted, and you wouldn't expect it, because again, what's so magical about it is just how simple it is, and how so much could just be stated and said, and it just hung over the book. Do you know what I mean? There wasn't overwrought description, and it's the kind of captures that very essence of being in your 20s and that early 20s and being conflicted, and the way everything feels so big but such a tiny little thing can unravel it all. I don't know, I just found it magical. I read it again and again, and I loved the adaptation. I know it's not for everyone, but I think it was stunning, really. And my last one, I don't know, I might need a bit of time to think about my last one. There is a book that I'd return to again and again called Free Food for Millionaires. It's a big novel, and I reread that at a specific stage in my life. I think I was kind of like late 20s, where I found myself rereading it again and again, and I think there's much in her writing that was similar to Jhumpa Lahiri's writing. It's about an American, I think she's Korean American, growing up in Queens and aspiring for more. And she has a series of relationships that are very troubling. What I really admired about it was just the scope and the sheer immensity and complexity of one girl's story, being captured in a way that felt really real and sincere. So though I have not read it in a while, partly because it is so big, the fact that I returned to a novel of that size, like I think it had been referred to as a modern great American novel because it was so so gigantic. But you know, for a novel of that volume to draw you back in more than once and on several occasions, it has to be ticking certain boxes. And I think a lot of it was as well, what I really loved about it was this minute detail of very normal everyday lives. So the girl in that book, the character, the main protagonist, her name is Casey, and she has this falling out with her parents, and she moves in with a daughter of a family friend that she kind of knows but doesn't really know, and they're in very different circumstances, but there's these descriptions of her home and her life, and they're just so specific, like the number of recipe books she has lined up in her kitchen, and all of it pieces together. So on its own there's nothing remarkable about it, but when it all pieces together, it says so much about each of the characters, and there's just so many layers that go into it. And again, it's one of those books that feels effortless, and I think if you can make those kind of, it's that writing that I really aspire to, is when tiny things are incidental and yet somehow they say so much when they're all pieced together. So yes, so that's Free Food for Millionaires, Unaccustomed Earth, and Normal People.
Wonderful. Thank you, Huma. And to make that writing seem effortless is the dream, really, as you say. But the amount of work that goes into that kind of piece is just maddening, really. It's got to be maddening.
Absolutely.
It'll be a lot of work. Speaking of work going into pieces, how did you prepare writing-wise for writing your memoir?
So it came about in an odd way. I never intended to write it. I mean, I never intended to write about my life because I don't think anyone ever does, right? You don't set this ambition that one day I'm going to write a memoir, because who am I to do that? There's nothing about my life that is dramatic or on a large scale. There's nothing about it that's fantastical, and often in not necessarily memoirs, but in that sort of genre of perhaps, I don't know, celebrity memoir, there's always some element of something huge that happens. That I think there's a big shift now. I don't think you get that many memoirs like that, not so much now. Now there's a lot more normal stories being told, which I think is really valuable and important. So I guess I never sat down and set myself this deadline of, you know what, I'm going to write a memoir. I'm going to write about my life, some of the most personal aspects of my life, and I'm going to write about my family and my love and my marriage and my children. I never, ever intended to do any of those things because I'm quite a private person. I don't write about those things ordinarily. I have touched on them for pieces that I've written in the newspaper, but I'm not shouty about them, and I consider myself quite shy, actually, or quite introverted especially about, you know, your day-to-day life. You don't want to put that in a book. However, I was reading a lot of memoirs. This was around the time that I'd had my third baby, who you have met, Andrew, Jude. I'd had Jude. I was reading a lot because I didn't have any time to write, but I had time to read, or I made time to read. And I found myself gravitating a lot towards memoirs that were written by women, memoirs about motherhood, just naturally, memoirs about just ordinary lives that were capturing these very specific moments of their lives. I was reading a lot of Rachel Cusk and Deborah Levy, Emily Pine, Sinead Gleason. So I found myself drawn to these real stories, I guess, that were not told in any way. They weren't told in these kind of glossy elaborate ways. These were just small truths and hurts and losses and difficulties, and they got through them. There was always some sense of getting through. So I found reading them hugely inspiring, but I still didn't think I want to write this. I just read them feeling immensely grateful for their honesty, really, and their generosity in being able to write so openly and boldly and quietly about massive things that had happened to them. So I found it really affecting. I read a lot of them. And I started around about the same time I started writing little snippets to myself. I was incredibly inspired by essays. There was this whole kind of, there was a spate of essays coming out, like essay collections had suddenly become really popular. Emily Pine's Notes to Self was one of them. And I read them and I just really loved the way that she captured some of the biggest moments of her life, again, in very simple writing, into these little bite-sized essays. So I started writing some for myself, not intending to show them to anyone, but I think in both reading these memoirs, but also just in living life, I was increasingly aware of how quickly time was passing and of how much what I was living, I was also losing. Just in terms of time moving on, there was moments where being a mother of 3 small boys under the age of 5 at that time was immense, and it was chaotic, but it was also incredibly joyful. And I would always be aware or sensitive to the fact that this was going to change and they were going to grow up. And this really moved me. And maybe it was hormones, maybe it was more than that. I think I've always been quite sensitive to a sense of loss, and it's always frightened me in some ways that you can't hold on to things and you can't hold on to people forever, is something that I write about in my memoir, actually, as one of the biggest things that has always just been impossible for me to fathom that can happen. So I started writing these little moments to try and capture things for myself. And it started off as a draft in an email. And I called the email Things My Children Say. And it was just a draft. It's never been sent. It's just for me. And I would just write things down. And it wasn't all about them. I just want to be clear, but it's not just about, I don't define myself just in terms of them, but it started off in that way. And then I wrote an article. I was still freelancing every now and again, and I wrote an article for The Guardian about memoirs. I wrote about how much I loved them and what it was about the rawness and the honesty of them that I hugely appreciated, and why we need to read more stories about people like us and also people not like us in order to enrich our own lives with a sense of humanity and difference and similarity, and just seeing yourself reflected in so many ways, not just in race and colour, but in emotional. I think it's so much value in an emotional connection, especially if that person is nothing to do with your everyday life. So I wrote this article and I questioned a sort of sadness that of all the memoirs that I'd written, hardly any of them were written by women of colour. And why was that? Why is it that the landscape hadn't yet shifted? And it wasn't an accusatory sort of piece at all. It was a genuine sort of, I would yearn to read everyone's moments of lives that they can offer. And yes, publishing does have a lot of problems with its access and inclusivity, and so it sort of raised these questions. So anyway, I wrote that article for The Guardian, and after that piece came out, I think the same day, an editor got in touch and said, "You show me what you've written." And so I did. I showed her. So that draft email, that what started off as a draft email, had by that point become about 5 essays. They were very different essays. And she read them. I sent them with a little bit of excitement, but not really, because they were very unpolished. And she read them. One of them was I mean, I can't even remember what all the essays were about now. There was only about 5 of them for her to read, but one of them just so happened to be about how I met my husband, Richard. And she read the essays and she said, I really love this one. But she said, I'm not sure that I think essay collections might have had their time from a publishing perspective, that, you know, there was a phase of them. I guess now you don't see them so much. It lasted for about a year, maybe, all those essay collections coming out. And she said, so, you know, essay collections aren't selling from an industry point of view. However, I want you to read this essay again, and I think you need to ask yourself what the real story is here. And so she sort of left me with that question mark. She said, think about what the real story is. Think about what you're really wanting to say behind the scenes of what you've written, and come back to me. So that would have been in early December last year, maybe late November. And so I sat there with a notebook, and I held on to her every word, because there was a part of me that believed nothing would happen, nothing would come of this. There was another part of me that believed something might come of this. I have to seize this. I have to make this a possibility and a reality. So I sat with this notebook and I'd written down everything she'd said in that meeting. And I wrote again and again in this notebook, said, what's the real story? What's the real story? What am I trying to say here? What's the real story? Again and again and again, really pushing myself, because I think what she was saying is, underneath the context of what I was describing, just how I met my husband, there was a lot more that I was self-editing, I suppose. And I knew that. You don't need someone to tell you that. In some ways it's common sense, but in other ways you do need someone to point out what you are choosing not to see yourself, which is the deeper story, the more emotional journey that you take to get from one place to another place. And so I sat down and I started writing, and this was December, it was the Christmas holidays, the children were off from school. I said I needed some time to work. I sat down and I wrote the first draft between December and February, and I sent it to her in February last year, 2020, and signed the book deal the end of February 2020, and that's it. Now it's coming out in 3 weeks. So that's my very long-winded story of how and why I wrote this memoir. So
yeah. All came about.
Got there in the end, yeah.
So big lesson, don't delete your drafted emails.
No.
And then when you're ready, send them off to a publisher, right?
Yeah, or put yourself out there in order to be seen by a publisher. Because I have to say, there may well have been that ulterior motive when I wrote that article, by hinting towards the fact that I wanted to see something that showed me a little bit of my life. Why not write that myself?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I was incredibly both lucky, but also I think subconsciously I was working towards that in some way or form, even though I told myself that I wasn't going to show those essays to anyone. I think at some point I probably would have, because it would not have been enough for me to write it for myself. I am a writer, and part of being a writer means getting it seen and getting it read and having that experience of knowing that you've connected with readers at a certain level. So yeah, I think it's slightly romantic and maybe a bit misleading to say I only wrote them for myself. At the time, yes, I did, because they were very, very unfinished, unpolished. But I think long term, if I had continued with those essays, I would have done it so that it was a standalone essay collection. I would have submitted it. I would have reached a certain point. I was fortunate that someone intervened and spotted what could be better than that, and helped me shape it into what it is now. So yeah, I'd say you do have to sometimes make your own opportunities as well.
And going with someone else seeing what the possibility was, there's always this trope of, you know, the lonely writer sitting on their own, but there's you know, a world around each writer of people who are supporting them, surely, and like people like this editor that have gone, actually, there's your piece, that's what we'd want. It's interesting that
It is. It's curious because as a newspaper journalist, working daily with editors, I never had my work edited, not to this extent. So you would get, it's a very different world. You're writing to very quick deadlines, and your work gets cut and it gets shuffled and jiggled around, but it's not a lesson for you. You don't have the time. An editor at a paper is not going to sit down with you unless they're very kindly and mentor-like. They're not going to sit down with you and go through your piece and say, actually, I've changed this because the tone of this isn't quite right, or this and that. They won't do that with you. And often it's not even as thoughtful as that. It's literally space and time. Cut, bang, 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 that's the story. Book writing is so very different to that. And I think what I have, and what's interesting to note is this is How We Met is my second book. The first time with my first book, I never really had an editorial process. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was approached by a very small independent publisher. There's a very small book, it's called In Spite of Oceans. And I didn't have an agent, I didn't have any advice, I didn't know anyone in the book writing world. So I just said yes, and I signed a contract not really knowing whether it was the right thing to do. And I wrote a book not knowing what I could ask for, what to expect. And because the publishers were so small, I had a publisher who was like the main guy that ran that division or whatever, but I didn't have an editor. I had a copy editor who took out all my semicolons and then I put them all back in, and that was it. So as a writing experience, to me, In Spite of Oceans, although it has got very nice Amazon reviews and very nice review in the Observer, to me it reads like a first draft. Now I know what's involved in an editing process, like a real editing process. I didn't have the time either when I wrote In Spite of Oceans because I just had my first child. So I kind of signed this first book deal and had very limited time in which to write it. So I wrote it very fast, which my journalism had trained me for. And also it was based on interviewing other people. So it was a very different kind of book. But with How We Met, I think what I valued most with my editor, Olivia, she's just, she sees your writing as it moves. You have an extra eye, and that is invaluable. You just have that person who knows and also she knows what you're keeping. She could see what I was keeping from myself that I hadn't yet put on the page, and she would just push me a little bit, not in a way that was uncomfortable, but just to say, I feel like we need to know more about this. I feel like we just need to see into your heart a little bit more and give a bit more. Obviously it is me, so I had to do it. I mean, it's my book, but I think that process of having someone to look at it, and not just one person as well, like the number of people involved on the book, from first editors to second editors to copy editors to proofreaders to lawyers to publicists, so many eyes look over the book, and it's just immense to know that you've got this support system, which is exactly right. You do the work, you do the initial work very much on your own, which I don't particularly mind. I'm quite happy being on my own, but equally when you're ready for it, to know that you're not second guessing, or that if you are second guessing, someone's there for clarity, is really valuable. And I guess if you're not at that stage with a book, that's what a writing group is there for. It's the same process, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. So I think I'll do one more question from here, from what I've got, and then we'll open to the floor, see if Becca or Lauren have any questions to pop into the chat or anything. If they want to start thinking of those now, just giving them a heads up. Let's see. So I've got a few here. Okay, you know what? What kind of question would you like to be asked?
What question would I like to be asked?
What would you like to be asked? What haven't you been able to express at many points?
That's such a good question. I don't know, Andrew. You put me on the spot. What would I like to be asked? Well, you've asked me very good questions that I liked answering. So does that do? Is that okay? Go ahead. You choose the question.
We'll do a simpler one, I suppose. Well, in my head, it's simpler. We'll see what happens. What's been your favourite form to work with?
Well, I can tell you what I don't like working with to start.
It's always a good place.
I don't like writing articles anymore. If that's what you mean by form. I think the process of writing a book, both fiction and non-fiction, has just, I very much like the freedom to go away, write lots and lots and lots of words, and then we get involved with other people. I appreciate that. I like the freedom that I'm given. As a journalist, that isn't, you write, I wrote at least what I was told to write. And I found that quite frustrating as a writer early on in my career. And I quickly realised that there's so many people that say they want to be writers and then become journalists. It's not really the same thing. I mean, it is. It will teach you a lot. It will teach you a lot about writing to deadline, about finding stories, but they're not people who say they want to be writers and people who say they want to be journalists. They're two very separate things. I don't at all regret the experience that I had. However, I am very grateful for the fact that it feels like a relief that I no longer have to do it. I much prefer writing long form, which is something I never thought I'd say, I guess, because I'd include short story collections in that. I now, having spent last year writing both the memoir but also the short story collection, which is called Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love, I always had a clear vision that it would be a collection. I knew that it would be a series of stories. So that idea of long form, at first, there would have been a time that would have really intimidated me. And still, I much prefer writing a 1,000 word feature than I'd rather write 81,000 word features than one 80,000 word book. But now I feel quite differently. I very much enjoy exploring where something's going, and I think that's what I'm enjoying so much about the first draft of my novel, which is about, it's probably over nearly halfway through a first draft. I've gone from the fear of trying to spend such a long time mapping it out, and I used to try all sorts of things. I tried the little note cards, I tried book boards, and I tried massive rolls of paper because I thought I needed to know everything in order to write it. And the greatest freedom is in acknowledging that actually I don't. And I'm allowed to let these people live in their darkest and saddest, most tragic ways and see if they come out of it. And I love that. I love the unknown and not knowing. So yeah, long form, ideally fiction, I think, is where I'm headed and what I am finding I enjoy the most.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Good. So if anyone wants to pop in the chat a question they have for Huma, if they have
Please
one.
ask me a question.
Yeah, you've had enough of me. I don't want any more of that.
No, I'd be very happy to answer more of your questions in case anyone doesn't have any questions. They're like, who is she? What is she talking about?
I could do one more if we don't get anything in a moment. Okay. Let's see. So we kind of have that one. So the thing is, I've written down a bunch of questions, and in the time, you've answered almost all of them.
Saying that you love my glasses, Becca.
Ah.
There we go. Would you know, they're not actually prescription lenses, they're blue light glasses. There you go. Oh. Yeah, because I was getting a lot of headaches and I went to the opticians and I don't have a prescription, but she did recommend blue light glasses to stop the strain. And I don't know whether it's just a psychological thing, but it actually makes it stop. You know when you get that ache right there? Yeah. So my top tip, blue light glasses.
I may have to get some of those.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So she said the trick is to wear them before your headache comes on, and then you don't get your headaches. Just yeah. Anyway, yeah.
I think that's a very good writer tip, especially in this world that we're living in with screens.
Also makes you look quite intelligent then too.
That's it. And if you feel that way, then you know that's what makes the writing pop off. You know, that's what does it. So with come back to your notebook, journal, and everything. Do you actually have any prompts that you start off with? You've never used prompts? Never.
No.
Interesting.
No, I don't. I only journaled like that once for an extended period of time. I did see the benefit in it, but it's not something that I have the time nor necessarily inclination to do every day. I don't know. I see myself as a bit more. I do love writing. It's all I've ever wanted to do, but I just don't. The journaling for myself I just don't have the headspace for it.
Do you find you sit with your thoughts and ideas then more?
Yeah,
like rather than
book ideas will work their way into a notebook. Sketch things very briefly now. I've given up on the big plans. I think because on Instagram when writers are sharing their process, there's some people that are incredibly impressively will plan their whole book on a massive corkboard and then they're ready to begin. And you know what, that's not for everyone. That may well work for them, and I think it's probably going to work if you're doing something that's really plot driven, like a thriller or a mystery, or something that has movements and people die and there's a suspect and that kind of thing. I can imagine you do need to map out certain big moments there because it's clever and it's intricate. But my kind of writing is it's more interior, and that's because that's what interests me, and it is definitely more on an emotional plane. So I don't journal. My notes are really quick sketches, like problems that have come up in my writing, timelines, those kind of things that I've not necessarily planned for, but I suddenly realized, actually, is this going to work? Because she's such and such age and he's that age and this needs to happen, and is that believable? And those are the kind of things I've never really had to map out before, and it sounds silly, but actually they're integral to getting. If I don't get those right, then many things will not be plausible. So my notebook is really it is just notes, it is question marks, it's scribbles, it's don't forget to check this. A lot of it, I suppose, is in here. I don't it's not like I've noted down my character. I haven't drawn her out in terms of, and I know they say to do that. I know they writing courses, like in the past, before I I think I was always really scared to just begin. So I just did a bunch of courses hoping that they would help me begin, but really I just needed to begin. And I know that exercise in mapping out your character is hugely valuable. But to me, in a way, especially with my short story characters, and they're almost all women, I feel like I know them in my head, which sounds weird, I know, and I think maybe that's just one of the weird things that writers do. I really do, and I feel for them, and I feel like maybe I've met them, not to suggest that they're actually based on anyone real, but that's how they feel to me, like they're shadows maybe of
like a memory.
Yeah, which sounds really woo-hoo, I know, but like I feel for them, like, and I can't explain it any more than that. So I don't need to know. I know they say to do. I'm guessing you guys have done that exercise in character. I know I did it on the Faber course. You sketch out every detail of your character, even if it doesn't go in the book, right? That's what they always say. You know what month they're born in, you know what star sign they are, you know what they like to eat for breakfast, all this and that. It's like, I don't need to write it down. I don't want to sound like that's arrogant or presumptuous. It's not that. It's just like I feel like I know them emotionally, so I kind of know who they are, but I also don't know who they are, and I like not knowing until they come out on the page.
Can I ask you, so, okay, this might seem slightly, I do have a reason for this. Would you class yourself as someone who's empathetic, so an empath?
I think so.
Okay.
I'd class myself as someone who is quite sensitive both to others and myself, I'd hope.
Yeah. Because in my experience, so in my experience,
are you a psychopath? Is that what you're asking me?
No, not at all. Not at all. It's more the thing of, it seems to me that people who are more empathetic, more sympathetic, more aware of, like actively aware of people around them going on, can hold characters in their heads a bit better. And so when they come up with a question in writing of what does this character do, you already know, because you've got all these other characters, and you're like, well, they would act like this, but maybe you don't do that immediate link. You've just
that is a really interesting and valid point. I think to a certain extent there is something about being a writer. I mean, why do you write? You're trying to figure things out, or you're exploring some essence of being human, right? And in order to do that, there is a certain degree of sensitivity. I mean, how many times when you're growing up and you become someone that either does a writing course at university with hopes of being a writer or a poet, or, you know, how many times, and I don't mean this specifically to you, Andrew, but how many times when you were growing up did people tell you were too sensitive, as if it was a bad thing? I don't know, maybe they didn't, but I remember being told that I was too sensitive, as if it was a bad thing, as if you need to be stronger skinned, when actually I think you're just, you know, when you're young and things upset you or you worry about things, it's because you have an awareness, which isn't to make you sound like you're gifted in some sort of supernatural way, but I think some people are naturally disposed to feeling more than other people do, and I think that's really important if you're going to write about humanity, which sounds really lofty, but if you're writing about a character, you're writing about a person and how they interact with themselves or with other people, and what that says about us as humans, and what that says about us as people and individuals, and in a bigger place of in families and all of that. And in order to do that, you have to be, there is something about having a heightened sense of awareness to other people's feelings and to your own feelings, because if you can't be aware of them, how are you going to write about them? So I don't know. I think you're right. But did you find that people that being sensitive is a I don't know, maybe I'm making that up, but I definitely feel like
Yeah.
That's something that sticks out for me. And then this is a way to channel that kind of sensitivity to other people's feelings or your own feelings, or feeling too much, like people say, you feel too much.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of too sensitive feeling, and then having sort of feelings that have little place to go outside of writing it down.
Yeah.
So if that makes sense, which is why I started keeping a journal in the first place, was to make sense of what was happening up top. And that sort of then blossomed into, oh, I could actually do this. This is a thing. You can actually pursue this as something for fun, but also live with it and hopefully make a living out of it as well. So it was an interesting step for me, not that this is a Q&A with me at this point.
Turn it into Q&A. Just keep going for another 2 hours.
Oh, goodness.
Everyone can have their turn.
Right, I can get Becca and Lauren in. It'd be great. So I'm excited. Becca said that she's also been told that she's been too sensitive to, or felt too much. But again, like, it's the thing. I think there's a changing in opinion where people are starting to see that as actually that's a very good thing, and we should hold on to that in society. We shouldn't lose that. There's a space for people who can stand, tall and strong, and that's great. Good, you can do that. But don't forget that it's also good to feel, and you should not that you should always be emotional, but it's not a bad thing to be emotional. It's a nice thing. That's a good thing. It means you're aware. It means you're living.
I was having that conversation with my eldest boy, Safian, who is 7, just last night, actually, because in an episode of being asked to tidy up, 2 of them reacted in a very different way to one of them, and my eldest, who is very sensitive, took it very emotionally, and we had to have a discussion about what being loved and being liked means, and that you can love someone and like them, but also ask them to do things sometimes, like tidying up. So yeah, we talk about big feelings, and I can recognize those big feelings that I know used to overcome me when I was small, and a sense of bewilderment as well, and not being able to understand. I think that carries through with you if this is the path that you choose to take, and you choose to become a writer and an author. That sense of bewilderment of wanting to understand something you can't quite put your finger on is always there, just wanting to push at it a little bit and see what's there, and see what hurts as well, which sounds really dark, but I do think one thing that's important to note is that my memoir is very different to my fiction, and I don't know if people reading my memoir who like my memoir might read my short stories expecting something else entirely, expecting something quite, uplifting, uplit, and it isn't. And I think I like the fact that fiction allows you to explore things that you can't always allow yourself to say and talk about. So
Would definitely agree with that. It's a wonderful, freeing thing. I think. I think I've run out of questions.
I was going to say, on that note, I think that's a good place to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much for doing this.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I think you're very lucky, all 4 of you, that you have. But no, in all seriousness, I think it's amazing that you can study this craft and have a kind of ready-made writers support group, which is something that I've never had. I still don't really have, not really, but I think it's great, because I think you'll find, I don't want to sound patronizing at all, but I think that you'll find that your writing it's going to develop it's taken me so long to figure out what my writing voice was. And I think it's great to have people on that journey with you, and to get over the fear of other people reading your work, which is still something that agonizes me. So
Yeah, I don't think it's super easy for anyone to do, really. It's not an easy one, reading other people reading your stuff. But speaking of people reading your things, we'll do a final plug here before I end the recording. If you want to throw out dates and what's coming up, there it is.
This is my memoir, How We Met, a memoir of love and other misadventures, and it will be out in approximately 20 days. Yeah, 20 days. 28th of January. Available to pre-order from all good bookshops now. And the Guardian review went up, I believe it's in the paper tomorrow, and came out yesterday. So yes, you can read it to find out more.
Cool. And the short story collection?
The short story collection, Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love, is very dear to me. So is this, but in my first fiction being published is just something I can't quite get my head around what that feels like. Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love will be out in November 2021 with Scepter, and my novel will be out hopefully 2022. So have a big deadline this year.
Don't worry. Brilliant. Thanks again, Huma.
Thank you all. I hope you all have a lovely day in lockdown and stay safe.